All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Power Lounge. This is your place to hear authentic conversations from those who have power to share. My name is Amy Vaughan, and I am the owner and Chief Empowerment Officer of Together Digital, a diverse and collaborative community of women who work in digital and choose to share their knowledge, power, and connections. You can join the movement at togetherindigital.com. Today, we're going to help you all learn a little bit more about product management. This has been a pretty popular topic among some of our members as they kind of consider and look towards a career change or pivot. And I'm really excited to welcome a fellow Together Digital member from the West Coast. Please welcome Cassina Boyer. She has 18 years of diverse corporate experience spanning project management, clinical research, advocacy, and product management. Cassina is now dedicated to coaching and facilitating teams, guiding them towards a product management mindset. She has a knack for getting folks unstuck. Her passion for nurturing future leaders and advocating for digital etiquette promises to inspire our listeners today. Sina, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Absolutely, absolutely. As I said before, I think this is an area that's growing, and I think it has a lot of folks curious, and it's, a space that I think some people kind of get intimidated by, right? Because
Mhm.
there's not like a scripted or a set path. You're a big advocate for this idea of a non-traditional path. But before we kind of get into all of that, I'm curious for you to share with our listeners what inspired you to transition from these sort of various corporate roles into focusing on coaching and facilitating product management.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'll kind of go in reverse of
Mhm.
essentially how we got here today. Almost a year to the day, actually. The decision was actually made for me in some ways. So for better or worse, my entire division was restructured, which is a fancy corporate term for basically saying
Mm,
laid off. So our
yeah.
whole group was laid off. It was a tough time, as you can imagine, rather emotional. I'm sure many can relate to that, especially over the last seemingly 18 months or so. But I really chose to take that time. And now I was in a position of privilege to be able to do so. I have a husband who's working. So, unlike many of my peers, I wanted to pause. I wanted to reflect and do a little bit of introspection on actually my values. I felt like I had lost sight of where I and how I spent my energy, and in turn was actually suffering quite a bit of burnout because of my own choices. Not even so much the company, but how I was operating and how I was leaning into almost like this fuel of adrenaline versus authentic rest. So I focused on restoration and by happenstance was introduced to a wonderful startup focused on a disease diagnostics technology in very, very early stage development. And I was like, why don't I try going independent and working with them to mature this idea into an actual product? So that was my really first foray around an area I'm really passionate about when it comes to healthcare and really progressing innovation in that space. So it felt like it was, kind of two birds with one stone, flexing the product skills and some of the executive coaching I've been wanting to really explore and was able to do all of those things kind of wrapped in one in a very new space for myself when it came to working in the startup. But leading up to that, I think I reflected on my, building out my resume, looking at essentially my background just to be able to share with others, like why you would want to work with me, right? Like, where's the credibility? I realized that thread of being customer focused, thinking about effective prioritization and leaning into efforts that matter was threaded throughout pretty much my entire career beginning with the end in mind. You may have heard that from Amazon's adage, like, who are you actually serving? Who is this for? What solution are you building? But really, how is it going to be utilized? Whether it was clinical research and thinking about patients and ultimately being able to navigate a complex protocol or what is their expected experience to working with patient advocates and understanding their stories and the importance of understanding that power of storytelling to then moving into technology and having your end users be your customers, even if they're internal that was all there. So it was really fun that I was able to wrap that up. And so while the choice was kind of made for me to pursue, I'm really grateful that that transpired because I don't know that I would have taken that leap myself, to be honest, or at least not for a while.
Yeah, it's interesting how, a lot of times things, it's a matter of perspective, right? Is it something that's happening to you? Is it something that's happening for you? And I
Right.
think your response, granted, like you said, you had the opportunity and a position of privilege to be able to take that pause. But that pause could be a matter of, hours, days, weeks, months, but
Exactly.
at taking any sort of pause at all to kind of collect your thoughts and really kind of look at the span of your experience and really say collectively, where are my strengths? Where are my passions? Where are
Mhm.
my interests? Where are my talents? And then collectively, like, where are my strengths and how do I serve others best? I
Right.
think is really great because I think something else that you said that really resonated there, and I think well with a lot of our listeners is, you know, um, that whole idea of burnout,
Yeah.
and sort of just kind of feeling and running off of that adrenaline of just constantly going. And there's absolutely nothing like having that proverbial rug pulled out from underneath you, such as getting laid
Yeah.
off, to sort of kind of snap you
Hmm.
out of it. And I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations like these. And you guys can go back and listen to many of past episodes, and how many women have sort of shared that their journey really began when those pivotal moments happen. So, for those of
Hmm.
you who are kind of in those difficult and challenging situations, I just want you to know it feels really hard right now, but this could be that moment that you get the chance to get back up on your feet and start something really new and something really different. Um, Katina, I would love for you to discuss with us a particularly challenging project or a situation that you
Yeah.
faced during your corporate career that maybe when you were doing some of this reflection that, helped you understand that how you approached it, like what were some of the lessons that you learned and how did that help shape how you approach leadership and management? Like as you were taking this time to kind of reflect and look back, was there something that stood out to you?
Yeah, and especially if I focus on that last piece, like what was the impact, right? And what was I able to carry forth into how I managed teams and hopefully how I came across as a leader. And so while I could spend time thinking about the rather personally challenging projects that really made me focus on my time management, now after the fact, I would have done things very differently. But one in particular, or I guess one example in particular, and then maybe 1A is thinking about the importance of being an ally and the importance of being really an authentic ally and taking the chance to speak on someone else's behalf, and how I was in that position of receiving someone who was actually looking out for me, and then how I translated that into my own leadership is something that will stick with me hopefully for the rest of my life. So not to go into the full specifics of the project, but essentially I found myself in a situation where I was representing the technical side of the house. I was supporting Expedia Group IT department from a product management lens. So my users, my customers were employees, and we were trying to solve for their needs when it came to support and working across what we called a cross-functional. So basically, many department led type of effort, which can get muddy. Leader representation, ownership can get really muddy. And so we were trying to pull this effort together. It turned into a massive program. I found myself in a situation of disagree but commit. I don't know if you've heard that adage from Amazon, I think. So essentially, I vocalized concern around how we were approaching this. It became, I'm going to try to limit the corporate buzzwords, but maybe we can make a bingo card afterward, but it's like a shortcut. But boiling the ocean, kind of looking at everything rather than
Mhm.
focusing on something more specific and niche and then iterating from there was the approach presented. And I spoke up and said, this is not going to work. We're going to fail because we don't have a clear mission and vision. I'm only representing essentially a slice of this, but also representing the voice of our user. So please listen. It didn't really amount to that, unfortunately. So I had to commit, right? That was the other part of it is I shared my disagreement, but okay, let me see how I can help make this successful. And so after months of trying to beat this thing into submission, we were not reaching a point of progress. And so I chose to bring the group together, really the leaders that were representing this effort. I brought in my technical partner, who represented essentially the development and engineering side of the house, and then worked with the program side of the house on this cross-functional team. And we just looked at each other and said, okay, something's got to give. It's becoming toxic. This is not productive. People are starting to complain about one another. Like, we have to move forward in a different way. And so I outlined an approach and a tactical shift, essentially, like we need to pivot. Um, there are some things that we can really look at and backtrack a little bit. Like, are we actually all aligned on what we're pursuing and what those end state goals look like? Kind of going back to basics, which can be very annoying, right? To someone that says we've already gone so far. Like, why did we go back? But we were getting, there's some nodding in the room. There's a small group of us, as I think it was like five of us, one person on Zoom, and made some good traction, had some good points made. And then my tech partner essentially echoed some of what I said and added to it. It's like, and we can do this tactically. And here's the timeline that I think we can deliver, really. So I was representing why it was important, what was the value, what can we do? He was representing the how of really implementing these things. And I experienced a situation of heat. I don't know if you've heard that, the hashtag heat kind of thing,
Uh-huh.
like repeat, where the other director, we'll call him John, protect his privacy because we have a good relationship.
Yeah.
All of a sudden repeated and it's like, Tom, my tech partner and ally goes, I really like what you said there, and I really love that you pulled this together as this effort. Thank you for bringing this to attention. Meanwhile, I was the one who did that. And in the
Hmm.
moment, I'm like, oh, that sucks, right? Like kind of taking the credit. But I was like, the idea stuck. I planted the seeds. That's good enough. I'm not going to go back and try to bring attention to this. It felt petty to be like,
Yeah.
that was actually my idea. And much to my delight, Tom goes, hang on. I just told you about the tactical delivery. This is her doing. She brought everything together
Oh,
and
that's
outlined it.
great.
And I brought it up to him years later. This is years
Uh-huh.
ago. And clearly it's still such an
Stays
impactful
with you.
moment.
Uh-huh.
And I told him about this, like, oh, I didn't remember that. I'm like, it's one I'll never forget because it
Yeah.
was so nonchalant, it was so
Hmm.
organic and
Yep.
natural for him to lead with that.
Hmm.
And it changed, like, and it was a bit of a checkpoint, for John. It was
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm sorry. And that was it. Like, he was more aware, we were
Hmm.
aware, and it was awesome. And
Yeah.
that moment really taught me the importance of taking stock of a
Hmm.
conversation of a room, especially if you're in a position of leadership and influence,
Hmm.
to note if someone is being spoken over, if you feel like their idea is being kind of, mixed in with others, and
Yep.
give credit where credit's due so that people feel empowered and actually comfortable to speak up. Otherwise, they
Yep.
never will. And that's something
Absolutely.
my peers and I really carried forth, like in our management meetings, and
Hmm.
really trying to, and we encouraged people to turn on their cameras because we had a globally distributed team. We were mostly virtual. Like, it's
Hmm.
not to force you to show up. It's so that I can see that you are in a position to participate and be engaged, and
Right.
that if you're being overlooked. So that
Yes,
was a really
exactly.
cool moment.
Exactly. Well, and I think sharing that why, or one of the most convincing words in the English language is because. The word because holds so much power because
Yeah.
it tells you the why, not just the how. And I love that the he Pete. I've heard a similar phrase, and I love giving language to these things because I think it helps those who are listening, whether they're allies or those who want to speak up on behalf of others, which I mean is allyship, is appropriation,
Mm.
right? When somebody speaks an
I heard
idea,
that.
it's a guy, and then another guy's like, "Oh yeah, great idea," but it was, really just an iteration of an idea that a woman just said. But I do think that one of the best ways to kind of cut that off at the head is to really have another man within the room, an ally, speak up and say, "Actually, let's redirect that to the person who actually
Right.
spoke up and gave that idea to begin with." And
Mhm.
it's small, but it's so significant for that person that you did it. And again, it's such a great, I love that story. It stuck with you throughout the years.
Thanks.
And
It did.
yeah, I had a leader, a CFO of a company once, and I feel bad because I don't remember the moment either. There was like mass layoffs at our company, and I could tell, and we were all stressed out, but it was a very hard day for him too. And he didn't want
Yeah.
to be seen crying because he's like this, big CFO dude, but
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I could tell he had been. And so like I guess I stopped him in the hallway and I just was like, are you okay? And he remembered that and has remembered that for the longest time. And he told me one day at lunch, he was like, I have never forgotten that
Oh,
moment
that's awesome.
because he says that was like one of the hardest days of my life, professionally, personally. He's like, I never want to live a day like that again. And
Mm.
he said, I just felt like complete and utter crap. And he said it was such a small moment. And I feel so bad for like not remembering the exact moment. I'm like, I'm sure he remembers like checking in, but
Yeah.
like I don't remember the exact moment. But it does make a difference and it sticks with people, whether you realize it or not. So
Hmm.
good for him. But yeah, I love that. That's a great example. And good for you. I think too, I think what this is showing is, that I think that women in particular have this ability to sort of have that broad kind of 30,000-foot view, but also that empathetic kind of granular view of what's happening with the team and that ability to see when things are turning toxic, right? Because you're not just focusing on like the output and the performance, it's also like, where are people at right now? How are they
Yeah.
showing up? How are they feeling? Like, what's the vibe of the room when
Hmm.
people walk in, And I don't know that, in a general, like, overly masculine environment, that's always something that we're paying attention to,
Hmm.
you know?
No, I will add my leadership team and my peers were actually predominantly women. It was really cool how we were able to carve out this team in a traditionally really male-dominated field, especially when it came to technology and IT. And
Hmm.
we almost developed the inverse of that, where we were the most vocal in the room. Now, we were
Hmm.
also more senior,
Hmm.
and I noticed that we tended to go down topics that made some of our male team members a little bit more uncomfortable or not as confident to speak up in. And it wasn't necessarily anything female, but it was just like
Sure.
obsession over certain music genres or, how we spend our time necessarily. And then we kept kind of, passing the mic to each other. And so it was
Uh-huh.
eventually like, are we engaging everyone? Let's like, okay, strong women, hush for a bit.
Right.
Let's let
Yeah.
everybody speak up. So it was almost like, well, wait, hang on, we're not doing any justice for,
Uh-huh.
we're not living those values ourselves. Like,
Yeah.
let's, so it was a bit of a, and we would check one another and say on Slack, like, hey, give, pause,
It's a
put on mute.
balance.
Yeah,
It's a
it's absolutely
balance. It's an
balance.
absolute balance. But I think that that's great. I love that. All right. So, as I mentioned earlier, you're passionate about helping others transition into product management. And again, this conversation was kind of spurred because we have a lot of folks who are interested in transitioning into product management. What insights or advice do you offer to those who are looking to sort of make a shift into this type of environment or role?
So I think when you and I first set this conversation up, it was for the fall. And honestly, now to then, I think myself changing mentally and the industry actually in many ways, which wasn't that long ago, right? But things are
Yeah.
changing so fast. I think I would have given a very different answer
Mm,
than today, actually. So just thinking about that, there is no direct path. My career is very much a jungle gym. And I think just about every product manager you meet, outside of maybe those in their early careers who are coming out of like an MBA program and tend to be recruited and kind of pulled into those job paths out of the gates, you tend to lean into projects and have a certain skill set that lends itself there organically and someone takes notice. So that could be a path. It is a lucrative career. I think the salaries are published, hopefully now pretty transparently, and that does draw people in because you obviously want to be compensated well for what you do. And so the paths are not direct for better or worse, right? So unfortunately, there's not a preset curriculum and experience that says, should you meet all these things, you will ultimately land in this kind of role. And I say for better because then you can make it your own. You can carve out the kind of work you want to do, the type of product you want to support, and the kind of company you want to work for all should be part of your evaluation. And then being honest with your own skill set. So, we all hear about imposter syndrome and kind of be it till you become it models and so forth. While that's great, if you don't have certain skill set and experience and knowledge, especially around language and vernacular, you will not be successful. So it's knowing the difference between do I actually have the skills and knowledge, or do I need to study up a bit more, get a bit more exposure, hopefully in your current job that can lend itself to that thinking and then eventually transition. And then, of course, if you do have the skills, own it, go after it, own your space. What I learned as a humbling experience. So I've interviewed with companies like Google, and to get into something like Google, don't ever bother applying directly. You will never be heard. I think you probably heard that from a multitude of, um, especially bigger companies. You need to have
mhm.
somebody that can give you a referral that can help expedite that because you will be lost in the sea of resumes. I mean, I think the role that I was referred to, I heard the number and I still have a tough time believing it. Something like 100,000 applicants, like seems
Yeah.
insane, but
Mhm.
okay, fine. So tried not to make that, intimidating. Fine. Went into it thinking, I got this. I've been doing this for a couple of years. I feel like I have the right skill set and aptitude, passion, right? I've been studying up on these kinds of principles and frameworks and so forth. And I get into the interview and got humbled real quick, real quick on help me understand how Instagram works and how you're able to get the algorithm. Like so techie and down into the weeds immediately. And this was the first part of the loop that I'm like, oh no, I know this to a point, and I know enough of this to work effectively with a technical partner and be able to challenge the logic and the decision-making prioritization. But to actually sit down and code the logic and sequence myself and understand how that's happening, with hands-on experience as a developer and engineer, that was not me. And so there was a little bit of frustration where I felt like the recruiter didn't really articulate that well enough of saying, like, for a technical role in a lot of these companies, essentially the FANG, right? Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, you really do need to have that background, whether it's self-taught or professionally, in order to get past that bar. And a lot of times what's frustrating is you probably won't even be doing that kind of work when you get into it. But what they're trying to eliminate is that imposter versus imposter syndrome, because you will be expected to get into the nitty-gritty from time to time and understand some of the complexity at a much higher level. So that's the one thing I'd say is if you're really looking at product and you don't have that kind of formal technical background, I wouldn't set your sights first at those big companies.
Hmm.
Never mind the fact that you will own a tiny piece of whatever process or for the foundational infrastructure. Like you will only be responsible for this piece of the checkout experience or this with SEO. That's it. This is your bubble that you live in,
Yeah.
right? And then working with teams to develop. So if you're really passionate about understanding the full life cycle and how that impacts users and bringing in that feedback and so forth, I say go after smaller companies. Product management is really becoming a lot more ubiquitous across a multitude of industries. Healthcare in particular, I think, is really starting to have a lot more of that discipline folded in and really exploring what it means to be agile. I think that's a lot of times at the core of where a product manager can come in and help a team shine is really working in what's called sprints and agile and iterative development, right? Not having that long-standing waterfall type of project. Obviously, it doesn't apply everywhere. But the flip side of those industries and companies that are a bit naive to setting up a product team or a product lens, thinking about the end in mind, your end users and customers, is that you probably won't have as robust of a support system, right? Maybe you're the first product manager. I was the first product manager within Expedia Group IT. And I think I had naivety at my back because in hindsight, it's like, what were you thinking? Like, this is a really hard sell actually to the team you're coming into. Never mind the fact that I didn't have resources or a community at the ready to be able to bounce ideas off of. So there's going to be kind of two sides of every coin when you look at these things and really evaluating within yourself at the start and the beginning. What are your values? What are your skills and strengths? What are the things you can learn on the job and you feel like you're confident, comfortable enough to, put together your list of literally Google terms. Like, is this industry specific? And I'm a little too insecure to ask in the room, and maybe rightfully so. Or is this unique to the project? But don't ever be afraid to ask. I've challenged and I'm okay to look the dumbest in the room,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to acronyms, right? We all love acronyms and it's
Hmm.
like, really, we need one more. But sometimes it's a shortcut, right? So everybody uses it. And that was always my thing is, can you help define that just so I understand it in this context? Right? Because it could mean completely something different if you're coming in from a different industry or even job. And oftentimes people go, what does that mean? I just noticed the acronym. So just a little bit of food for thought when it comes to that. There are a ton of resources out there, almost too much actually, when it comes to figuring out if you want to do this and how you want to do this. There's a lot of communities. I'm part of Women in Product.
Hmm.
They're wonderful in trying to support one another and sharing those learnings and how do I do the following? And I have this problem. There's product school. So there's the massive, almost university type of communities, forums that you can pay money, you can learn. It kind of becomes a little bit more framework oriented, which I do caution people in getting obsessive with understanding all the frameworks. If
Hmm.
you don't like fundamentally understand why you're doing this, I guess as a pseudo plug, I have two partners and I that are toying around and we're kind of in the product discovery phase, if you're familiar with the life cycle, on creating actually a forum in a community, and we're calling it Peer Path Academy, trying to understand and how to provide a more tactical approach and pragmatic approach to learning product. And
Uh-huh.
like if you think about like how do we get here, it is a windy path and it is convoluted,
Yep.
but there are some things that are fundamentally like core to understanding it. So
Hmm.
if folks are interested in learning and providing some feedback, I'd love to chat with you about just your own experience. Because at this point, we're very much in that like, what does this look like stage, just kind of
Hmm.
shaping it. But there's a ton of Coursera offerings. Google
Hmm.
offers a bunch of courses that you can really get yourself to build your confidence more than anything. It's build your confidence and understanding um, essentially like where are my gaps and how do I study up quickly to just be familiar with code types to know the difference
Hmm.
between Node.js and Python and Java and C++. Like you don't need necessarily to do it everywhere, But you should know if your dev is suggesting, I want to do this versus that, to be able to challenge, well, why? Why would we go down this path versus another?
Right.
Not so much how to do it.
I mean, this is exactly why we're having this conversation because it can be such a black hole. And I
Yes.
love that you guys are working and trying to solve that problem for some because I think, product management is going to continue to be a growing and critical career path
Yeah.
and role. It is essential for all of the technology that is continuing to thrive and grow.
Hmm.
So yeah, I love that. And I can only imagine the analysis paralysis that sort of
Yes.
comes with it. Again, I think, we were joking before you jumped on here about our Together Digital community and how you're such a great fit for it because we're all just such constant learners and how
Hmm.
it can be sort of it's like a blessing and a curse all in the same. So if any of you want to reach out to or connect with Christina, you can through our Slack and nerd
Yeah,
out some more and maybe kind of share some of those things and insights to help her start to shape
please.
the community and the support that they're going to be creating for those who want to start to kind of go down this path. Because I agree, you need to start to be able to define the areas and the spaces in which you do want to specialize so that you do know, again, sort of like what are the rules so that you can get in there so that then you can break them. And, again, you're kind of working in the spaces and the places in which you have defined your strengths, your
Yes,
passions, your abilities, and then you aren't burning yourself out chasing down the paths and the opportunities that maybe aren't right and aren't best
exactly.
for you. Because I think this is what excites me about this area of work as well, is because there is lots of opportunity here for
Yes,
folks, right?
yes,
There's so many different areas and different types of products that you could be helping to build and own that are solving a lot of problems for people. So yeah, lots of rife with opportunity. All right, let's see. My next question that I've got for you, in your experience, what are some common misconceptions or stereotypes about product management that you frequently encounter, and how do you go about debunking them?
So something I've learned falling into this role, because I really did, I got pulled into it when I was blessed with a director that saw something in me that I didn't even know about. And moving through working as a product manager and then a manager of a product, and then eventually getting laid off and watching the industry from a very different perspective, is that product management is defined very differently depending on the industry, the organization, and the type of company, like the size of the company. And so when I was actually tasked with recruiting my team, so I was in a wonderful position, opportunity, had the opportunity to build out a team during the recruitment cycles. What I learned is that folks coming in from, say, Microsoft with a non-technical product type of background or role were often actually more program manager-esque, if that makes sense. So they really weren't in the mix of building out a strategy as much or as often, and were really focused on more of implementation. And in some ways, it then became more of a product owner role. So you'll hear like product manager, project manager, program manager, and then product owner. And excuse me, there's a lot of thought leaders who are super frustrated by how this has evolved or devolved in certain ways. So I definitely recommend following leaders, thought leaders on LinkedIn, Marty Kagan to Itmar Gilad to Teresa Torres, Kim Scott. Like there's a number of people I'm happy to share. I think the book list I gave you, Kaylee, has a number of those folks listed. And so what they're really advocating for is keeping those concepts pure, because at the end of the day, you're setting someone up for failure if your expectations
Yes.
are coming in, right? As, oh, I'm going to be running a program and really helping implement the execution versus, oh, I'm actually more earlier in that life cycle I mentioned before of the product, of whether you're now doing research around your user base and their problem areas and things like that. Those are very two different skill sets, right? You
Hmm.
can build both, absolutely, but you also should not be able to do both, because that's exactly when burnout happens, is if you are tasked with managing all aspects of that, you're not going to be able to do it well. You really need that durable team, is something I think Marty Kagan coined and in inspired, is how do you empower people to have the right ownership of these things, of being a decision maker when it came to what are we solving for and why. Really, in my belief, is the product lens. Is we can do a bunch of things. We can be a feature factor if you want and continuously roll things out. But if no one is using them, and if they're not actually meeting the mark of solving for the problem, we failed. And so
Hmm.
you need to be able to distinguish that forethought and be able to look at a landscape, look at industry trends, usage trends, and so forth, which is typically a product lens, and understanding how then that needs to be passed to someone really strong, equally as strong, right? There's not a hierarchy thing here to then execute and deliver on that vision. Both are needed. And I think a lot of times those get conflated.
Yep. I agree so hard with this because it's sad and it makes me frustrated. People lose their jobs because of these
Yes.
misconceptions. I think
Yes.
that's what makes me angry is like you said at the beginning, people get set up for failure because the people at the top that are leading organizations don't understand the nuance of the roles and the titles
Yep.
and the needs of the roles and the responsibilities and the needs for specificity and those skill sets to be filled by the right people that
Yes.
it ends up setting people up for failure. I think somebody I just noticed in the live chat with our live listening audience, somebody said this is so insightful. I'm an associate product manager and I got thrown into my role with no background, so this is extremely helpful moving forward in my role.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. So I'm glad that you're finding this helpful. And then I was just on a
Good.
call with a mentee of mine who lost a teammate because I think they were just kind of set up for the similar kind of situation where it was just there was no clear definition of their role, their responsibility, process, checks
Yes.
and balances, and they kind of just were thrown under the bus. And, and they didn't even have like a direct manager because they didn't know where to
Mm,
place them because there was like, they were like, where do we put them? Like, where do they belong? Who do they belong
yeah.
to? So because it is sort of like a newer sort of role responsibility, I think there's a lot of organizations that are still kind of figuring a lot of this out. We did also thank you, Kaylee, by the way, for those who are live listening. And we'll include these links in the notes. We've got a great reading list that Casina mentioned as well in the chat. So lots of great books. We love our book references. So thank you for that.
Of
Hillary
course.
had a quick question, so we're gonna ask this one really quick because I actually jotted Scrum down earlier too. I was going to start to get to it, but I didn't want to nerd out too hard, but since Hillary brought it up, have you or do you practice Scrum or Agile management and any recommendations along which is the best framework to look into there?
So I guess I'll end with the last part of that statement. There's no such thing as a best framework
Mm,
on its own. It's understanding the context, right? And where are you trying to plug it in? And I think what everybody will probably start to pick up on, especially now that I've called it out, in the courses and things that you may take, almost every time the instructor will stop with, that depends. It depends on who you're solving for, what is the nature of your team. And it's really frustrating because you're like, great, give me those tactics and give me that sense. But
mhm,
really, what it comes down to is understanding exactly the environment.
mhm,
How is your team structured? So, for example, the startup I'm working on with right now and helping support move, and I help them move into an agile and Scrum type of approach, they're developing a physical device. You can only be so iterative when it comes to lead times of ordering ahead circuit boards and certain hardware and firmware, right? Whereas other things where you can look at, okay, we're also creating a UI, user interface, that complements with the device. And there we can be a bit more iterative and a little bit squishier when it comes to long-term vision, essentially, or specific tactics, rather. And so with Agile and Scrum, I think there's a place for waterfall, especially when it's like a physical build out. So if you're building an actual office building, for example, there's going to be things that require you to think long term to establish that you really can't iterate on. And so Agile and that kind of development is really key for areas that can be very dynamic. So industries that are really highly dynamic, that are really dependent on user feedback too, where you have the ability to have that flex and implement something different. But if you're building an office and someone says, hey, actually, we want 16 floors now, you're going to be like, no way. You're going to have to
yeah.
move, right? That's not reasonable in that context. So for frameworks and actually implementing things that work well, I mean, there's thousands out there, unfortunately or fortunately. So it's also looking at who are you solving? Who are my people? Who are the people that are building this? What is their skill set? What is their familiarity with when it comes to the degree of maturity and agile development? If you're just starting out, keep it simple. Thinking about a product canvas, for example, and really laying it out. And if you use tools like Miro, there's an amazing Miroverse, they call it, with templates out the wazoo. There's people on LinkedIn that post them all the time, but really it's thinking about what are you solving for? Why? Who's consuming this information?
Hmm.
thinking about the people, and then leaning into, okay, I have a shortcut. Templates are shortcuts. Frameworks, they're really just shortcuts to get to implementation and a way to be able to create cohesive and collective language. That's what it is at the end of the day, is are we all on the same page and aligned with understanding how to use this material? Really, because I think people get so obsessive with some frameworks and you get to it and it's beautiful. And then we're like, I don't know what to do with this and when and why, right? So don't start with the frameworks, but start with your problem statement. Who are
Yes.
you solving for? And then go out and try to find the resources that should give you guidance on how to use them appropriately.
I love it. I love it. Put up my little praise hands for that. It takes me back to a couple episodes ago when I spoke with Katie Robert of Trust Insights, and we were talking a lot about when how AI might not always be the answer. We love it because it's the shiny
Yes.
object, but AI might not always be the answer to everything that you need because it's that whole shiny object syndrome of we get so obsessed with the solution. Yeah,
Hmm.
Scrum's cool, Agile's great, but is it always the answer? It depends on what you're building. It depends on the team, the structure, the support you have, the timeline. There's just so many things. And I just loved all of those examples that you gave. I think they're really good, solid examples of
Cool.
why you should really take into consideration um, what it is that you're building, what the problem you're trying to solve is,
Yeah.
versus focusing so hard on the solution. Think about the problem first, then think about what
Hmm.
the best solution is versus kind of trying to fit the square peg in the round hole. Great question. Thank you so
Well,
much.
and
And
just
great
something
answer.
inspired, thank you. Something inspired when it comes to AI. I actually heard during a product networking meeting that someone was coming up with a product, I think it's called a chameleon or something like that, to basically replace product managers, to replace the thinking power and the strategy through an AI engine.
Okay.
And I'm like, interesting. Okay.
Hmm.
Now, I love AI. I love ChatGPT. I feel like it gets you past that blank page and gets you
Hmm.
to something a little bit there to work with.
Sure.
The idea of replacing people with these skill sets and be able to see, to have that, we used to call it eagle and mouse vision, where you're able to look up and see the
Yeah.
world in front of you, right? Or look
Hmm.
down and actually see what's my next step. They can't do that.
No,
Yeah, I
no,
cannot do that.
no, no.
So
It
it's
doesn't
like,
have the
what?
empathy and the intuition that we do that we talked about
No.
earlier, right? Of like, it can't read the room. AI can't read the room and tell me if the team, like, it could tell me, like,
Right.
maybe the output. It could read the output of,
Exactly.
productivity to some degree, but it can't tell me if the team is coming in feeling completely deflated and confused.
Right. It'll
And
never tell you the why. It won't, not effectively.
exactly. Exactly. Oh my gosh, we're getting such good engagement from our live listening audience. Thank you all so much for like jumping in and
Thank you.
chiming in. And Wendy um was kind of feeling that whole frustration of job seeking and this whole kind of
Yeah.
conflation of product program and project management roles and how people are just kind of blending them together. And it is a frustration. I will ask you just to kind of, hop on Wendy's bandwagon here. It to you, would you see that as a little bit of a red flag when you walk into a company and they're doing hiring and they're kind of conflating all these roles together?
Yes. Yes. And it really depends on your tolerance for teaching them, right? So if
Mm,
you're coming into a smaller company or where product management is a bit novel, it's an
mhm,
opportunity. You can help shape it. If it's a company that's more mature and they've operated this way, then
mhm,
you have a decision to make of whether or not mentally you're actually saying, I'm switching to program management. You can call it product all you want, but I'm going to make that translation and understanding fundamentally what are you looking to deliver end to end. But if there's not this acknowledgement in some regards, and that's really challenging, right? In the interview to be like, do you actually mean the following? And I've done that. Like,
Yeah.
this doesn't make sense to me. My expectation would be X, but you're telling me Y.
Mhm,
Um, Help me understand. And so I would say you will have a really tough time trying to translate kind of all your learnings into what they're looking for.
mhm,
So absolutely advocate for interview the team and the people as well, that are interviewing you on whether or not there's that clear alignment.
yep,
During my last year, even though I am independent and pursuing this effort, I was also interviewing with a few companies, in part for market research, actually. I don't know if I
mhm,
say that out loud, but I wanted to see what are companies looking for and what kinds
yeah,
of questions and what kind of environment are they describing. And one company I interviewed with that seemed wonderful. It was a really interesting, it was Smart Things. So the company that's basically doing Internet of Things and bringing together this infrastructure for, your Google Home to talk to your doorbell and things like that. And we get through it, and they're like, well, do you have specific Internet of Things experience? Like,
Is there such a thing?
right? I'm like, it's like coming out of college, but we want you to have 15 years experience. And I'm like,
Right.
what? And they're like, we love you, we love the approach and things like that and whatever. And I
Yeah.
wasn't actually, in all honesty, I wasn't leaning into a role in earnest. I probably shouldn't have been interviewing that far. I probably should have backed out,
Yeah.
earlier, but I wanted to see, and I was really curious about
Yeah.
what could be.
Uh-huh.
And when we got to that point, I'm like, thanks, but no thanks. Bye.
And you're like, with that question, I'm out.
Right? Like, that's the other caution is because there are, unfortunately, and I think one of the things you probably will lead into is how competitive is this place.
Yep.
There's tens of thousands of people that are looking for work right now
Hmm.
within program and project management. And that's the unfortunate truth.
Yeah.
And so, but equally, there's thousands of jobs out there. And I think it's really the art of finding that good mesh and matchup
Hmm.
of, both skill set and values. And so it's really taking into account that if you get a rejection and a no, it's probably because they're literally looking for a very specific human being, not
Yeah.
even transferable skills, but
Mhm.
have you done this exact thing in this capacity?
Right.
Which almost seems like, unless I actually worked with this company before, the answer is probably going to be no,
Hmm.
right? And so I don't take that as discouragement, but take that as they have somebody very specific in mind. If that's
Yes.
not you, it's totally okay and it's probably not a good fit.
It's not personal. Well, and you said it earlier too, and I meant to kind of bring it back home and reemphasize it. And I don't keep saying it. It's not always about what you know. It's who you know. Networking,
Yes.
it's such an important aspect to the job market right now. You need people speaking your name in the rooms you're not in. And there are so many people applying to jobs right now, even if they're not publicly looking, they're quietly looking.
Absolutely.
And you need somebody to put your resume in front of somebody else's face right now. There's just no way around it. If you don't have somebody handing your resume over, just kind of assume it's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
It's a long shot if it is. So yeah, don't apply for every single job you see on the internet. Do the extra time and research to find somebody to make sure that that
Yes.
resume gets to somebody who works there. Since we're on the topic really quickly of interviewing, one of our live listeners, Jamie, had a question about interviewing. Do you have any tips when it comes to interviewing, questions to ask to see if the company knows how they define product manager? I've left interviews or declined to follow up with interviews because I don't feel like they know what they wanted,
Yeah,
but it was more of a gut feeling.
that's a really great question. And kudos for leaning into that too and
Hmm.
having really the guts to speak up and clarify because you don't want to come away with that misconception. So interviewing as a general, as I said before, take awareness that or have some awareness that when you're going after these really big companies, they are very formulaic. They will expect you to do certain things. The loops are difficult. They will expect you to solve questions like at Google, I had, how many restaurants would you estimate are in San Francisco? Go. And you can't say, well, I would Google that, right? No. So you basically have to go through the math and the logic applying to it and things like that. So those companies expect you to be able to, they're calling it thinking outside the box, but actually there's a way to train yourself. So if you're interested, there are companies called, I think it's like PM exercises will literally have examples from a bunch of different companies and how you answered them and so forth. But for gauging the culture, engaging essentially like, are you on the same page for that definition? I would lean into in the day-to-day role or the core responsibility for this person, presumably a product manager. What is their focus area? Are they focused on delivery and execution? Or are they in the room talking through the strategy, the mission and vision, and really advocating for the user?
Hmm.
And I think that would be a good starting point for the
Yeah.
conversation on, are you looking for me to execute, which most good product managers know how to, right? In some life, you've had a project type of role or you've been able to deliver, whether you are our former informal developer engineer type of background. But at the end of the day, it's not about how to do this, it's why and what. And that's maybe it's my own personal hill that I will die on and not be eligible for many careers in the future. But I do fundamentally believe that you need to build a partnership with your technical team and
Hmm.
that trust that you can then pass off and you can agree to your success criteria, acceptance criteria, all of those agile type of functions. You've clarified the language and the expectations, and then you've passed the baton for them to deliver and then come back to you with, okay, here's the feedback and here's where we need to judge it a little bit. So those kinds of thoughts of like, help me understand a day to day. What is their you can even get into agile if the company operates at agile. If they're not, that would be a huge red flag, actually. Like if you're not doing agile and you expect product management to come in and be successful, that's more challenging. That to me says more program.
Awesome. Super helpful. And then somebody had asked about the PM exercises links. Kaylee shared that in the chat too. So thank you, Kaylee. All right, let's talk for a few minutes about digital etiquette. I'm gonna start folding some questions into one another because we're getting close to time. But this has been
Okay.
great. I love all the questions we're getting from our
Me too.
audience.
Thank
Let's
you.
talk about digital etiquette really quickly. What are some strategies or practices that leaders can implement to foster a culture of digital etiquette within their organizations? And can you define digital etiquette for us as well?
Absolutely. So this is something I've unexpectedly fallen into. This seems to be the my tale in my memoir will be unexpected maybe. But so my time at Expedia, I supported internal products. So I was an internal product manager essentially, looking at our employees as the customer,
Mhm.
just for a bit of context. And so what we learned, sometimes rather painfully and other times organically, is that when you're implementing change, when you're implementing new technology, or really a shift to even a new platform that is expected to be used by a majority of people. And it could be your customer base in general. It could be consumer facing products as well. Think about the nature of behavioral science essentially and how people interact within those tools. And together digital is a Slack user as well. So there are certain kind of cultural norms and mores that are expected. And what we learned almost after the fact, so I helped bring Slack to Expedia Group and we consolidated, believe it or not, 11 different messaging platforms, which seems insane, but implemented this massive tool and basically said, okay, here's some guidelines, here's some things around channel usage and best practices and so forth. But we're not thinking about cultural differences and how this tool could either be a really powerful enabler for the kind of culture you want or be disastrously toxic for it. Because a lot of times people have a very blurred line nowadays between work and life, right? Which is also for better or worse. We kind of go from these technologies and some of the practices we use, whether it's texting your friend to how you message someone professionally, there's probably some carryover, right? Use of emojis and shortcuts and things like that. And so what we learned and had to retroactively instate essentially or implement is this consideration around digital etiquette and not Slack bombing, not sending messages one after the other because you're elevating someone's anxiety or saying, hey, without any context. I'm sure I would be like, no. And people have even, I know devs that have even created like automated responses to do not tell me, hey, and whatever else. And here's how I want it to be responded with, right? Like super aggressive. But really thinking about how does technology help enable your culture? How can you help educate and not expect that people will assume and understand because we're also different, right? And how we operate is different, whether it's generationally, regionally, geographically, right? Globally, you're going to have different types of cadence as you speak and actually how you interact with technology as well. And so digital etiquette to me is really thinking about what are the guardrails you can implement, whether it's a configuration to say you cannot do the following here, or the best practices you can help educate so that people have awareness around insensitive speech, not safe for work emojis, things that could be viewed as gaslighting, aggressive, all those kinds of things. It's a really great opportunity to actually make it a bit more neutral. And this isn't about, your personal life on Reddit. How about it? This is a corporate professional environment, right? Hopefully in some capacity. So
Mhm.
there's going to be different rules and expectations you need to follow, just like you have an appropriate code of conduct, right? If you're hopefully thoughtful company around educating people what's expected of them, this should be
Mhm.
really folded in. And it does go into security and the type of files and content you put forth, but really it's how do you interact with one another? And that really matters to a corporate culture.
I love it. That's great. Super insightful. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that. That's so great. All right, let's keep going. Mentorship. This one's really important, especially in
Yeah.
such a tricky, kind of new and evolving space and field. How do you approach mentorship? How do you talk about it? And how do you sort of develop a successful mentorship relationship?
Hugely important, especially as we just mentioned, if you're coming in as the only product manager on a team, or maybe it's really early in that company's journey in incorporating product management practices, or just in general, right? I think finding a community, building a community if you don't have one. At Expedia Group, we broadened it to actually the broader department. So it's not just insulated within IT, and we were able to learn from people that were more mature. Um, It could be outside of your work as well. You know, these kinds of communities are amazing together
Yep.
digital for finding and cultivating relationships that can be mutually mentorship-esque, right? Like I have certain backgrounds and skills that you do not, and vice versa. How do we lean on that and provide a perspective that's different than our own? And so I think we get caught up in this concept of I need a formal mentor. And that's great. I think if you have someone that you can find, and if companies have programs that encourage signing up and kind of aligning on backgrounds and experiences and making that a standing monthly, weekly connect, great.
Mhm.
But it doesn't have to be so formal and so rigid. What we did a lot of times as a team in Expedia is using peer reviews. And so peer review is mentorship in many ways, where you come up and say, okay, I have a presentation coming up, or I have this idea, or I wanted to pursue something. And we went through these exercises that may be viewed as a bit brutal to someone new to it, but you really tear down the idea. It's not the person, it's help me
Right.
understand the following. I love radical candor for that, where it's like,
Hmm.
I really want to advocate for you on behalf, but I don't understand this. And where is this
Hmm.
going? That's a mentorship scenario where that person is helping you think through and refining a message or a strategy down to the essentials so that it could be effective. And I think a lot of people walk away and go, well, that was a mentorship. Well, they taught you a few things and they help you become, as a sounding board. So those kinds of experiences too that are more around something tactical and
Hmm.
actually tangible could be a great way to learn as well. So I would be open to a variety of ways. Become a mentor, even if you feel like you're
Hmm.
new to your career, because it's like, you learn best by teaching essentially.
Hmm.
Having someone to walk through and see it from their perspective will help you ultimately. I've mentored quite a few people in my career and I've learned so much from their perspective and
Yeah.
just like understanding, especially generationally, like where are you coming from with this? Help me understand how to manage my team better because I don't
Yeah.
speak this language anymore. And so I think there's a whole bunch of different flavors. Pursue, internally, externally, build those, sorry, corporate speak, outside your company, inside your company,
Yeah.
um, and really try to make them authentic. I think the whole thing where it's like, okay, give me all the advice, someone's gonna be like, for what? Like, I don't know
Right.
you, right?
Yeah. You need to come in prepared. Yeah. I love it when like the mentee really kind of owns the relationship and is
Yes.
accountable for sort of setting up the time, showing up. I love the construct. A former mentor of mine kind of gave this to me of the three C's, which is you come with a comment, which is a general status, a celebration, which is something that is worth talking about and celebrating since you met last, and then a concern, which usually takes up
I
most of the
love that.
time. But that
Yeah.
even if it's like last minute, I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, I can at least think of one for each of these three C's to go in with to talk about to make sure that we make good use of the time with them because I'm not huge on the formality, like if it's overly formal. And I do agree with you.
Hmm.
I think the internal is great, but the external, there's just this additional sense of psychological safety when you get outside
Yes.
of your company's walls. When you have that kind of trusted, space
Hmm.
outside of the corporate walls, that makes it just a little bit easier to
Yes.
have those harder conversations sometimes. And I love your addition of the peer mentorship. I think it's such a big oversight on a lot of our parts that, somebody that's just a half step even ahead of you, you don't realize like they know, they remember, it's so fresh in their minds, like where you are.
Hmm.
That's why I know Together Digital, we've got our peer groups. And I'm like, people, get
They're
into your
awesome.
peer groups,
They're awesome.
leverage that membership benefit because it's such an important aspect of opportunity for growth. And I love that you mentioned Kim Scott, and I noticed she's in your book list as well. And her book is on
Hmm.
my shelf, Radical Candor. It's such a great read for those of you who haven't read it. Clear but kind. It is a great way to mentor people in a way that, provides the opportunity for growth in a way that is, again, clear but kind.
Yeah.
Mentorship. Yeah, can't say enough about it. It's such an important way to keep people growing and again, not leaving the industry, you know,
Hmm.
not leaving the industry altogether.
Absolutely.
We gotta keep women in the workforce, you know? We can't keep just running in the other direction.
Right.
Uh, all right. Let's see. How are we doing on time? Oh my gosh. All right. Let's say, oh my goodness, this has been so good. How, so we've got the list of books. That's great. We've also gotten the list with the chat, how folks can connect with you. So
Mhm.
that's great. I'm going to go ahead and wrap with, this is a complex little world, this product management
Yeah.
and, digital landscapes constantly evolving. while ensuring that your team stay aligned and focused on goals, how do you kind of stay up to date with things? How do you keep yourself motivated and on track personally?
A great question. Sometimes I do not. Oftentimes I do not.
See, that's okay. I love that answer because that's
Often do
okay.
not.
Oh my gosh. We always want to be peak performance and perfect and on top of everything. That is okay. We
No, and I
just
love
keep
the
doing our
book.
best.
Right, exactly, exactly. Like my husband is like, "Did you beat your clone today?" Right? Of like, "Did I exercise and all the things?" I'm like, "No, today we're buddies. It's fine. Like we're just at bare minimum, like showered and had a good meal. That's about it."
Right? I love
Um,
it.
but in terms of trying to help others, and right,
Mhm.
especially when resources and time are at stake beyond just your own, it's really thinking about the end in mind. So if you're looking at
Mm,
delivery, if you're looking at what could we do next, and we have 1,000 different things coming at us to include maybe even our executives and leaders have the magpie effect of, like you said, the shiny new thing, and they want you to implement, and then we have all this feedback from these teams. It's really being ruthless in your prioritization and really evaluating all the things that are coming at me. And this is actually the expectation of a product manager. That's what I would expect them to do, is to be that conduit,
mhm,
evaluate all the different potential things that are coming at you, and then looking through and saying, well, why would we pursue any of them? And having strict criteria. Like when it comes to actual, like you are pre-implementation and you are accountable to building that backlog and the list of things that we will go after next. And I actually do this personally as well. Like of all the 10,000 things I can do, what are the things that are the most important? The book
mhm.
Essentialism is amazing for help focusing on that.
Yeah.
And what are the things that become a distraction, where it's like productive distraction? I love that concept of like you feel like you're doing a bunch of stuff, but actually it's not helping you move ahead in any one
Hmm.
direction. So it's really looking through that lens of, is this going to bring the value we're looking for, the impact we're looking for? Does this align with our mission and vision and strategies? Because all of a sudden you could be presenting something that's like, what is this? This doesn't align with any of our goals, but well, this
Yeah.
exec wanted it, kind of like the hippos. If you ever look up the animals of the product kingdom, it's pretty hysterical. All the different types of people you may encounter. The hippo, right, highest paid person opinion, saying, "I'm going to do this," and then people run off and do it, and they go, "Why did you do this?" It's like, you told us to. Well, there's a way to avoid that, right? Is to evaluate, did it meet this criteria? Did it score
Hmm.
high enough on maybe our heart score of talking to people? But that's actually the number one thing. And this is something I do that's so nerdy. I check in with my family, my friend, myself, my friends. Like, is there anything you want me to change? My husband and I have like reviews, which sounds so ridiculous, but it's like,
I
is
love
there
it.
anything I did that pissed you off this week that really you felt like I wasn't doing well
Mm.
enough? And it comes from a place of, it's 20 years in the making. So we've taken
Yep.
time to really communicate and learn that, but it's
Hmm.
seeking that feedback, seeking that introspection, and then
Hmm.
going back and looking ahead and say, how do I do better? How do I use
Hmm.
this time more effectively? And then it's kind of wash, rinse, repeat over and over.
I love it. It brings us right back to where we started, I feel. It's like now instead of getting mowed over by being laid off and slowing down, the enforced slow down, now you've just taken that moment, every
Thank
week
you.
to just kind
I
of
hope
slow
so.
down and reflect.
I hope so. Some weeks better than others. Some weeks I'm like, we'll just
Oh,
survive.
I
I'm
feel you, friend.
surviving.
I feel you, friend. Well, we're all going to take that, all right? We're just going to make that promise to each other right now. It's Friday. We're coming into the weekend.
Yes.
We are all hardworking overachievers who are going to do good things in the world, but we are also all going to take a breath. We're going to acknowledge and celebrate our wins. If you're a member, jump into that win channel, share a win with
Yes.
us this week. Katina, it's going to be that you are finally on the Together Digital
Yes.
podcast.
100%.
And yeah, and then we're gonna celebrate those wins. We're gonna prioritize. We're gonna keep that end in sight. This was such a fantastic
Thank you.
conversation.
I
Thank you
agree.
so much. I'm so glad we finally got to have it. There's so
Me
much.
too.
Take a look in that chat and see just how happy people are
I
with
appreciate
all the
y'all.
amazing
Thank
stuff you've
you.
shared.
Thank
So
you
be
all.
sure to take that in before we hop off. Everyone, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure as always. Such a blast. Again, if you need to chat more with Katina and you want to, nerd out more, feel free
Please.
to. You can find her in our Slack. If you're not a member yet, togetherindigital.com. Jump on and join us. If
Please
not, we
do.
hope to see you next week. Until then, everyone, keep asking, keep giving, keep growing. We'll